4th of July, 1954, Bern, Switzerland. The time is 5 PM, and the biggest game of football is about to be played as the 5th edition of the World Cup is coming to a close. On one side, a squad full of amateurs, who as a nation are still recovering from the war. On the other side, many people's pre-tournament favourites, the best team in the world, and not that they know it yet, a nation that, even 70 years later, will never have it so good on a football pitch. But to even get to this point, we need to go back 8 years to the 26th of July 1946 in Luxembourg City. The same day it was announced that Brazil would host the 1950 World Cup, the Central European nation of Switzerland was selected to host the 5th edition of what is now football's greatest competition. The 1954 World Cup was originally meant to be held in 1951, 2 years after the proposed date of the 1950 World Cup. But FIFA, making a logical decision, I know, insane, decided that so close to the end of the war that that would be a stupid idea. And the very next day, the World Cup was moved to 1954. This was also going to be the first World Cup broadcasted on TV. The games would be broadcasted to 8 different nations, and these nations were West Germany, Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Switzerland. Qualification. Usually so simple and not controversial at all. Yeah, you can probably see where this is heading. I'm going to start off nice and easy. In Europe, the 10 groups had 11 spots guaranteed. Group 3, the British Home Championship, saw the top 2 qualify. Those top 2 were England in first and Scotland in second. Unlike 4 years prior, Scotland decided that second place was good enough and they were heading to their first World Cup. Groups 1, 2, 4, 7, 8 and 10 all consisted of 3 teams, with the group winners qualifying. In Group 1, West Germany, now back in the fold, won their group ahead of Norway and Saarland, who will only see once in this series, and were actually managed by Helmut Schön, who managed West Germany between 1964 and 78. Spoiler alert, he did quite well. In Group 2, Belgium qualified ahead of Finland and a Sweden side who was severely handicapped because they still wouldn't allow players to play for their national team if they were playing the game professionally, which all of their good players were. This was actually the first time Sweden failed to qualify. In Group 4, France scraped through their group by winning all their games and scoring 20 goals in the process. The 8-0 against Luxembourg could have gone either way. Group 7 saw Hungary qualify without even playing a game as Poland withdrew and Iceland had their entry rejected. Group 8 was fairly bog standard as Czechoslovakia topped their group ahead of Bulgaria and Romania, who also failed to qualify for the first time. Finally, in Group 10, because nobody in Asia wanted to play against Israel, they let Yugoslavia and Greece have a go against them. 5 of the 6 games in this group ended 1-0, with Israel 0 to Greece being the only outlier, but Yugoslavia topped the group, winning all of their games. Groups 5, 6 and 9 had 2 teams each. In Group 9, Italy beat Egypt home and away, confirming qualification. In Group 5, Austria annihilated Portugal 9-1 with the great Ernst Happel scoring, as did Eric Probst, who scored 5. The 2 sides drew in Lisbon and Austria qualified, but had Portugal just won that game, a playoff would have been required, which is exactly what happened in Group 6. As Spain and Turkey had a victory each, a replay inside the Stadio Olimpico was required. That game finished 2-2 after extra time. So now what? Another replay? No. Penalties? Of course not. No, lots were drawn, and a 14-year-old Luigi Franco Gemma, whose father worked at the stadium, was selected to pick the name of either Turkey or Spain out of a pot. Blindfolded. Gemma picked Turkey, and that is how they qualified for their first World Cup. In Group 11, history was made, as actual games of football would be played in the South American qualifiers for the first time ever. Peru withdrew, and Bolivia were denied entry, meaning whoever topped the group between Brazil, Chile and Paraguay would qualify. That team was Brazil, who won all 4 of their games. It was a pretty similar story in Group 12. Costa Rica and Cuba were both denied entry, and Mexico topped the group against the USA and Haiti. Finally, in Group 13, a spot for Asia was guaranteed for the first time ever. Taiwan withdrew, India and Vietnam had their entry rejected, so it was only contested between Japan and South Korea, facing each other for the first time. Japan were massive favourites, and the idea of spending so much to send a team across the East Sea with such a small chance of winning didn't please the Korean government. Also, South Korea's president Syngman Rhee, who had been tortured by the Japanese only a few years prior as they occupied the nation, refused to let the Japanese team in. The KFA looked to work on the government to let them play, and manager Lee Yu-sung even said to President Rhee himself, "We will beat Japan. If we do not, we will all throw ourselves into the East Sea." An agreement was made, but both games would be played in Japan. Nevertheless, despite the home advantage, Japan succumbed to the Koreans, losing 5-1 and then drawing 2-2. For the first time ever, South Korea had qualified for the World Cup. Therefore, including holders Uruguay and host Switzerland, all 16 teams were confirmed for the 1954 World Cup. Right, it's time to tell you the format, and it's one of the most confusing yet. 16 teams, 4 groups of 4. Fairly simple. 8 teams were seeded, 8 were not. The seeds were decided before the qualifiers finished, so Spain's spot as a seeded side was taken over by Turkey. Each group consisted of 2 seeded sides and 2 non-seeded sides, with the top 2 sides in the group going through. The 2 seeded sides wouldn't face each other, meaning each side only played twice in a group, unless a playoff was required if second and third were on the same points. If a game was drawn after 90 minutes, it would actually go into extra time, where the game would finish irrelevant of the score. Finally, the knockout stages would see one side comprised entirely of first place teams and one side of second place teams, meaning the final would guarantee a group winner versus a group runner-up. Group 1 comprised of Brazil and France as the seeded sides, with Yugoslavia and Mexico as the unseeded sides. Copa America runners-up Brazil only retained 6 players from the squad of 1950 that so tragically came up empty-handed, yet the squad was full of talent. In the Brazil squad, Julinho. An eccentric right-winger with a fabulous eye for goal, he became a Fiorentina legend, winning the club's first Scudetto in 1956. Julinho was also the first Brazilian to play in a European Cup final, when his Fiorentina side lost 2-0 to Real Madrid in 1957. There are more players to talk about in this Brazil side, but it's honestly worth leaving them for the next World Cup. Actually, one thing I do have to mention is that Brazil would wear their famous yellow jersey for the first time at this World Cup. The French squad involves 6 players from Iran's side dominating French football under Albert Bateau, and in 2 years' time, they would compete in the first ever European Cup final. One of these players was 22-year-old Raymond Kopa, who'd go on to be one of the best players of his generation and Ballon d'Or winner in 1958. Yugoslavia were Olympic silver medalists, so God knows why they weren't seeded. In their squad, Vujadin Boskov, who became an incredibly successful manager, taking charge of Real Madrid, winning a La Liga and a Copa del Rey, although he is still the last Madrid manager to lose a European Cup final, a 1-0 defeat to Liverpool in 1981. But most notably, he led Sampdoria to their most successful era, winning 1 Supercoppa Italiana, 1 Cup Winners' Cup, 2 Coppa Italia, and the club's only Serie A title. But, much like his time at Real Madrid, Boskov lost in the final edition of the European Cup final, this time ironically to Barcelona. Also in the squad, Milos Milutinovic and captain Stepan Bobek, who both scored in the very first game of the European Cup in 1955. In goal was Vladimir Bera, who was considered the greatest goalkeeper of all time by a goalkeeper many considered to actually be the greatest of all time, Lev Yashin. About football, Bera said, "My time was the time of romantic football. There were still lots of good moves, dribbles, and attractive goals. Tactics still hadn't eaten football. It was the playing style of the 1962 World Cup and then England in 1966 that started the new era of football, when the ball was no longer the most important thing in the game." Long story short, Bera called football of the 60s utter woke nonsense.
The game's gone.
Now, there is a solid case for Group 2 being one of the single most insane groups in the near 100-year history of the World Cup. But let's go through the teams first. Seeds Turkey and Hungary alongside West Germany and South Korea. The Turkish side were one of, if not the youngest side at the tournament, with an average age of 23, and with only one player having more than 10 caps in their locker, this side was incredibly inexperienced. But one of their players was Fenerbahce inside left, Lefter Küçükhandanyadis. Now is probably a good time to apologise for any mispronunciations. One of the greatest Turkish players of all time, Lefter was the first Turkish player to ever move abroad for a transfer fee when he signed for Fiorentina in 1961. He was seen as an elite dribbler, and for Fenerbahce, a wonderful goal scorer, scoring 423 goals for them. A true legend of the Turkish game. Regarding the next side in this group, Asian Games silver medalist South Korea, there isn't too much to mention, besides their insane journey to get here. Firstly, they had to board a ship to Japan and fly from Tokyo, but the plane wasn't big enough. So, 12 players and the coach flew to Zurich via India and Italy before arriving into Zurich. The rest of the players managed to find a flight from Bangkok on the 13th of June, and they eventually arrived late at night, the day before their first game. The trip started on the 10th of June, it ended on the 16th. West Germany were, in theory, in their first World Cup, and although football still wasn't professional in the country, the nation harboured some very good players. 5 of these players played for Kaiserslautern, who had won 2 league titles in the few previous seasons and finished as runners-up in the most recent league campaign. The team that beat them, Hannover, had 0 players in this World Cup squad, and I'm really not sure why, because they beat Kaiserslautern 5-1 to win the league title. Anyway, one of the Kaiserslautern players was Captain Fritz Walter, and the fact he even made this World Cup was a minor miracle. After being captured by the Soviets and held in a Ukrainian reception centre, waiting to be sentenced to a Siberian camp and possible death, a Hungarian guard recognised Walter, who had recently watched him beat Hungary 5-3. The next day, Walter was mysteriously removed from the Gulag list. Also in the squad, Fritz's brother Ottmar, Max Morlock, who spent an insane 24 years at Nuremberg, a team who now have their stadium named after him, and Polish-born Richard Herrmann, who Derby County wanted to sign whilst he was a prisoner of war in England. The FA didn't allow it to happen. West Germany's manager was also one of their pre-war managers, Sepp Herberger. According to German football writer Uli Hesse, Herberger set the precedent for how Germany's national team coaches have always behaved. Their job is not to field the best players, but to field the best team, and that started with Herberger. Herberger had formed a tight-knit squad and even added Helmut Rahn into the side simply for his character. What a decision that proved to be. Nevertheless, the country was in turmoil after the war, and with economic sanctions heavily affecting any potential growth, a miracle was needed to boost morale. Finally, the Olympic champions, Hungary. The best team in the world, Hungary had only lost twice in the 50s, and their style of play was iconic. Goalkeeper Gyula Grosics was a mobile goalkeeper named the Black Panther due to his colour of clothing. Grosics was somewhat fortunate to play in this World Cup, as in 1949 he attempted to flee to the west before getting captured. He was put under house arrest, charged with treason and espionage, and was banned for 2 years from the national team. The charges were eventually dropped and the ban was reduced to 1 year. But the one thing this Hungary side were known for were their incredible number of goals. Their strike force included Sandor Kocsis, who is one of only 4 players with 50+ caps to have a positive goal-to-game ratio. Some of the scorelines Hungary were producing were incredible. 12-0 against Albania, 7-1 against Turkey, and 5-0 against Sweden. From the start of the decade and up to the 1954 World Cup, Hungary had scored 133 goals in just 33 games. However, despite a 2-0 win in the Olympic final against Yugoslavia, 2 results stand out. Their 7-1 home victory over England just under a month before the World Cup, which defender Sid Owen said it was like playing people from outer space, and their 6-3 victory over England inside of Wembley Stadium, the first time the Three Lions had lost at home to a non-British side. It was an imaginative combination of exciting ball control, speed of movement, and esoteric vision that knitted together to formulate a style of football that was as innovative as it was productive. Outpaced and outmanoeuvred, we were skittled as 6 goals hit our net. Although Ferenc Puskás scored one of the greatest goals of that era in the game at Wembley, making a mockery of Billy Wright, it was hat-trick hero Nandor Hideguti's role in the team that brought about a new development in the tactical side of the game. It was all down to MTK coach Martin Bukovi. Bukovi played the striker deeper, using him more as a false 9 and pushed the inside left and right higher up, creating a front 4 with the 2 wide players. You'd think with his tactical knowledge, Bukovi would be Hungary's coach, however he was way too disruptive for the regime's liking. So, the job was given to Gustav Sebes, whose strength came in politicking and management of the whole outfit outside of tactics, which pleased the regime. Sebes implemented Bukovi's tactics into this Hungary side, but originally started Peter Palatas as the centre forward with Hideguti out wide. However, this all changed in 1952 when Hungary were 2-0 down to Switzerland. Hideguti, already 30 years of age, was subbed on for Palatas. Hungary won the game 4-2, and such was Hideguti's influence, the position remained his, and up until the 1954 World Cup, he scored 11 goals in as many games. Hungary's incredibly flexible system saw the 2 fullbacks advance higher than the centre-half, commonly Gyula Laurent, making him a sweeper. When the fullbacks pushed forward, it was quite common to see the wingers help out in defence. Inside right, Josip Bosic was given the freedom to assist Hideguti higher up, leaving Josip Zakarias to drop deeper to do the defensive work. On paper, it was an MM, but on the pitch it resembled more of a 4-2-4. With how incredibly ahead of the game Hungary were on their tactics, mixed with the quality of the side, nobody could stop them. Group 3 is where we see the first home nation in the unseeded Scotland alongside Czechoslovakia meeting the seeded Austria and current world champions Uruguay, who by this point had still yet to lose a World Cup game. Uruguay's squad only featured 7 players from their 1950 winning side, including the great captain Obdulio Varela and scorer in the famous game against Brazil, Juan Scafino. Omar Mendes was the youngest player at this World Cup, but one new player that stands out is defender Jose Santamaria. Santa Maria was selected for the 1950 World Cup, however his side Nacional barred him from playing as Uruguay wanted to play him higher up as an inside left. 3 years after this World Cup, he joined Real Madrid and spent the rest of his career there until he retired aged 36. It's fair to say Santa Maria's time at Los Blancos was incredibly successful, winning 4 European Cups and 6 La Liga titles. Austria were managed by former player and captain of the famous Wunder team of the 30s, Walter Nausch, and had 10 players from Rapid Vienna. Nausch had actually missed the 1934 World Cup after an injury in the qualifiers, and with Germany annexing Austria, he never got the chance to play in the competition. As his wife was Jewish, Nausch was advised to divorce her, but instead fled to Switzerland alongside her, and it was here where Nausch would begin his career in coaching before moving back to Austria in 1948 to become the national team coach. With Nausch in charge, it probably comes to nobody's surprise that Austria's side of 1954 emulated that of the Wunder team. Much like the Wunder team, this side too was full of goal machines, including Erich Probst, Theodor Wagner and Ernst Stoyapsel. Behind them, a phenomenal core, including Gerhard Hanapi, Ernst Ockwerk, Ernst Happel and Karl Koller. Now let's talk about Scotland. The more videos I make, the more you'll realise that Scotland don't do World Cups normally. So what load of nonsense did they get up to in this World Cup, I hear you ask? Well, despite finishing second once again in the qualifiers, Scotland did attend this World Cup, but there was 0 Rangers players as they were touring the USA and weren't allowed to go. 2 of Hibernian's famous front 5 in Bobby Johnson and Willie Ormond were selected, however Johnson left the camp through injury. Celtic only allowed 3 players, Bobby Evans, Neil Mochan and Willie Fernie to go. And finally, out of the 22-man squad, with 5 staying at home in reserve as per the rules, only 13 players went. Scotland did however have a manager for the first time, in Huddersfield's gaffer Andy Beattie. The final group consisted of the seeded England and Italy alongside Belgium and the hosts Switzerland. England had only managed to keep 5 players from their World Cup escapade that ended in disaster 4 years prior, and although they had some experienced players such as the versatile forward, known as the Preston Plumber, Tom Finney, the captain Billy Wright, the Lion of Vienna Nat Lofthouse, and of course, 39-year-old wizard of the dribble Stanley Matthews, 14 of the 3 Lions 22-man squad had only played a maximum of 3 games. One of these players was 22-year-old Manchester United striker Tommy Taylor, who many saw as the ideal replacement for Nat Lofthouse. With Taylor on his way to becoming an England great, scoring 16 in just 19 games, he'd perish alongside his 1954 World Cup teammates Roger Byrne in the Munich air disaster in 1958. Host Switzerland were managed for a second time at the World Cup by Karl Rappan, the man who founded the Bolt formation, revolutionising the game by using 4 defenders, something Uruguay used in 1950 to neutralise the Brazilian attack. Nevertheless, defending was the last thing these boys were doing prior to the World Cup. Their record between the start of 1953 and the start of the World Cup read 9 games, 3 wins, 2 draws and 4 losses. Summing up the sign of the times, they scored 17 and conceded 25. Belgium were managed by a Scotsman formerly of Celtic and Everton by the name of Doug Livingston, a man who had taken his managerial game abroad to Sparta Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Finally, Italy were led by a technical commission with World Cup hero Silvio Piola and Angelo Scavio surrounding a Hungarian of their own, Leo Seisler, who made his name in Sweden by taking Norrköping to 5 league titles in the 40s. By 1949, his success had garnered interest in Italy from none other than the Rossoneri AC Milan, who hadn't won a league title since 1907. From Norrköping, Seisler brought in Gunnar Nordhall and Nils Liderholm. Gunnar Gren also arrived from Gothenburg. The 3 Swedes were iconic in Milan and were given the nickname the Grenoli Trio. In the 1950-51 season, Seisler and his Swedish trident finally ended the agonising wait for Milan's next Scudetto, and they did it by scoring a ridiculous 107 goals, which was still 9 fewer than the previous season. Right, let's actually get into the football now, starting with Group 1. The 2 opening games in this group combined with the opening games of Group 3 on the 16th of June, but starting in Geneva with Brazil versus Mexico. The Seleção romped to an easy 5-0 victory over poor Mexico, whose World Cup record now stood at 7 games and 7 losses. In this game, a moment of history. With his goal, Baltazar became the only player in World Cup history to score in 2 opening games. Gigi, the inventor of the Fola Seca, more commonly known as the knuckleball, scored a wonderful free kick. And Julinho, who the English commentator describes as the king of the dribble, scored a fabulous solo goal. The commentator also said that the Mexicans should stick to bullfighting, which I don't think he'd get away with nowadays. Yugoslavia beat France 1-0, meaning as long as Brazil and Yugoslavia drew their match against each other 3 days later, both sides guaranteed qualification to the knockout stages. Their game ended 1-1, which absolutely nobody saw coming. The referee for the game was Charlie Faultless, and his performance can only be described as solid. In the game between France and Mexico, the Central American nation were just 2 minutes away from gaining their first ever World Cup point, until Raymond Copper scored the winner from the spot. From top to bottom, the final group standings read Brazil, Yugoslavia, France, and Mexico. So, as I said earlier, Group 2 is wild. In the opening games, West Germany faced Turkey and Bern, who took a surprise lead thanks to a fantastic solo goal from Suat Mamat. West Germany took that goal personally and responded by scoring 4 unanswered goals. So, 5 goals in that game? Surely Hungary and South Korea can't do better than... Yeah, Hungary won 9-0. Sandor Kocsis scored a hat-trick, Puskás and Paletas scored braces, resulting in the largest win in World Cup history so far. To be fair to South Korea, considering their intense travel schedule, they probably weren't in the best state to play this game. Although, one South Korean player did make history for themselves, as aged 39 and 57 days old, Park Hyu-chung became the oldest player ever at a World Cup. A record that really wouldn't last very long. What the result meant, however, was that Hungary and West Germany only needed a draw against each other to guarantee qualification. But, unlike Group 1, Group 2 didn't deal in draws. Making 7 changes, West Germany played a weakened side because, well, they thought they'd lose, and at worst, a very winnable playoff would be required, and they got tanked 8-3. Kocsis once again showed his attacking prowess by scoring 4, taking his tally up to 7. But this game had a devastating effect on Hungary, as Werner Liebrich of West Germany injured Puskás, who had suffered a hairline fracture of the ankle. Meanwhile, a Burhan Sagan hat-trick and an unreal Kuchukan Nanyadis goal saw Turkey beat South Korea 7-0. South Korea's goalkeeper Hong Deok-young became the goalkeeper with the most goals conceded in a single World Cup, conceding just 16 in 2 games. So, with Germany losing and Turkey winning, a playoff between the two nations was required. Before the game, sacks of hate mail had been arriving into West Germany's camp, calling for Herberger to resign. With all of their star players back and Herberger reading the mail in an attempt to inspire his team, the game was about as one-sided as it could have been. In fact, one fan even wrote, "If the head coach of the national team doesn't know his duty to the spectators and fans, he's better off buying a rope and hanging himself off the nearest tree, ideally ensuring that the rope doesn't snap." Brutal. In the game, West Germany's Max Morlock scored a hat-trick in a 7-2 victory, and they qualified for the knockout stages. The group saw 41 goals scored at an average of 8.2 goals per game, numbers we will probably never see again. The first set of fixtures in Group 3 saw Uruguay versus Czechoslovakia and Austria versus Scotland. In Bern, champions Uruguay beat the Czechoslovaks, but the story comes from the other game in Zurich. England, who had been training alongside Scotland, were in attendance to cheer on their fellow Brits, who, according to the Liverpool Echo, were throwing tradition overboard by training on the day of their match. Initially, Scotland made life hard for the Austrian goal machines, who struggled with the rough play of their opponents. Nevertheless, in the 33rd minute, their defence was broken down by Eric Probst, who scored the game's only goal. Andy Beattie resigned as Scotland manager after this game, and his role was taken over by the physio. I'm telling you, Scotland just don't do World Cups normally, and for this World Cup, they were just woefully unprepared. To understand just how unprepared Scotland were, the Scottish FA didn't realise that summers in Switzerland could actually be quite hot, and the players paid the price for it as they were made to wear their heavy cotton shirts and heavy shorts. Their football boots were also about 20 years out of date, whereas their opponents were kitted out with more modern, lightweight gear. Former Manchester United manager Tommy Docherty even said that he lost half a stone during the national anthems. Really though, this wasn't Scotland's only issue. In reality, there was a huge gap in skill between the home nations and sides across the world, and no game proved this more than Scotland's next game against Uruguay, where a Carlos Borges hat-trick helped La Celeste to a 7-0 victory. Jack Harkness of the Sunday Post wrote, "Sure, we had our tactics, sure, we had our preconceived plans, sure, we had all the old-fashioned Scottish ideas ready to pull out of the bag, but there was one big snag to all of these secret weapons. To carry out these plans, we needed the ball, and those Uruguayans just wouldn't give us the ball to play with." He then went on to predict Uruguay to face Hungary in the final, with the two-time champions adding to their tally. The final game in this group had Austria also annihilate their opponents, beating Czechoslovakia 5-0. Uruguay finished top, with Austria finishing second. Meanwhile, Czechoslovakia and Scotland would have to go home to lick their wounds. In Group 4, England's team for their first fixture against Belgium was announced 6 days before the game by the selection committee, and they saw themselves as huge favourites. With Stanley Matthews starting the game, he beat Park Hyu-chung's record of being the oldest World Cup player just 10 minutes after the South Korean set the record himself. Much like pretty much every other game, this fixture was played at breakneck speed and ended 3-3 after 90 minutes, meaning that this was the first group game ever in the World Cup to go into extra time. Both sides scored one each in the second half and the game ended 4-4. England manager Walter Winterbottom called the draw heartbreaking. After the game, England had a huge issue, and that was the fitness of Stanley Matthews, who pulled a muscle during the game. The England-Belgium game was chaotic for the entire 90 minutes, yet the chaos within the space of about 10 minutes in the Italy-Switzerland game arguably exceeds it. At 1-1, Italy's Carlo Galli thought he'd made it 2-1, however the referees came to the conclusion that it was offside. Not taking the decision very well, the entire Italian side surrounded Brazilian referee Mario Viana, who responded by punching Italy's captain Gianpiero Boniperti. A few minutes after the scuffle, Josef Hugi scored Switzerland's controversial winning goal. So how did the Italians respond to this? Well, not only did they beat Belgium 4-1 in the next game, they also beat up referee Viana as he was entering the changing rooms after the Switzerland game, something he failed to report. 3 days later, England beat Switzerland 2-0, meaning a playoff between Italy and Switzerland was required, which Switzerland won 4-1. The 1954 World Cup saw the return of the knockout stages, as host Switzerland kicked off the first round of 16 game against Austria. Two of the lowest scoring sides still remaining, surely this game couldn't produce many goals. Right? The game kicked off 5 PM local time, and 90 minutes later, Switzerland were already 3-0 up, seemingly trying to have the game wrapped up early considering the 40-degree heat in Lausanne that day. By half-time, Switzerland had scored a fourth, however in between Switzerland's third and fourth goals, Austria had scored 5 and even missed a penalty. At half-time, Austrian keeper Kurt Schmid, who was a heavy smoker, collapsed in the dying heat, and for the remainder of the game, he was being told which directions to go by the masseur, who was stood by the goal with a sponge in his hand to regularly wipe on his forehead. Even though Austria had a goalkeeper who didn't even know what planet he was on, the goals in the second half actually slowed down quite a bit. Austrian Wagner and Swiss Hugi completed their hat-tricks, with Wagner's third almost starting a riot after Charlie Faultless didn't live up to his name by ignoring a blatant offside, and the game ended with a record 7-5 scoreline to Austria. No World Cup game since has ever produced more goals. Austrian keeper Schmid, who was taken to hospital after the game, commented a few years later, "People kept enthusing in the highest tones about what a great match it was, and I always replied, you can tell me what you like, I can't remember a thing." Swiss newspaper La Liberté wrote, "The Austrians gave us a magnificent demonstration of a fast, airy game, precise like a well-regulated mechanism, of an art of standing out, of deceiving the opponents by body feints, subtle passes that made their opponents go into the void. Our defenders were often mystified." A good reason why the Swiss defence may have looked a bit mystified was that their captain Roger Bouquet, who had received a stray elbow during the game, was, according to Switzerland's keeper Eugene Parlier, running on his own, paying no attention to the ball. He even passed by in front of me without noticing me and carried on behind the goal. At half-time, Bouquet even thought Switzerland was still 3-0 to the good. So why was Bouquet acting like this? Was it to do with the intense heat, the stray elbow, or the fact he was suffering from a brain tumour during the entire tournament? Personally, I'd just say it was a combination of all three. Being played at the same time was the battle between Uruguay and England. Could England, the teachers of the game with the returning Matthews and Lofthouse, be the ones to hand Uruguay their first loss at a World Cup? Well, unfortunately, not quite, no. But they certainly didn't embarrass themselves by only losing 4-2, which was quite flattering for the Uruguayans, whose first goal was clearly offside. However, one reason why England may have played better than expected might have something to do with the fact Varela injured himself during the celebrations for his goal. Although Varela still played because there were no substitutes, he was practically a passenger, and Schiaffino took his place at centre-half, such was his quality. The next day, West Germany faced Yugoslavia in Geneva, although it was originally meant to be held in Basel. Yugoslavia entered this game as heavy favourites, and the crowd was heavy in the support of them. However, during the game, their tune seemingly changed a little bit, thanks to West Germany's performance as the spirited underdogs. "Let the Yugoslavs keep attacking," Herberger told his team. But take them down coldly, intelligently, with aplomb, he added. Victory of tactics, wrote their kicker. Herberger's tactics of sit back and hit on the counter worked to a T. Yugoslavia attacked with desire, but no precision. Tony Turek produced a performance of a lifetime in the West German goal, whilst in the Yugoslav goal, Bera had practically nothing to do besides pick the ball out of the net. It was a real team effort from West Germany. Inside right, Max Morlock played as an extra defender whilst being an option going forward, and next to him, Fritz Walter produced an unbelievable job marking the dangerous Zlatko Tchaikovsky out of the game. To the shock of many inside and outside of the stadium, West Germany won the game 2-0, cementing their place as semi-finalists. As one iconic game started the quarterfinals, an iconic fixture ended it, and although the game between Hungary and Brazil had a ton of goals, the violence was what stole the headlines in a game eventually known as the Battle of Bern. Brazil, who considered their last World Cup a national tragedy, knew they had to pull out all of the stops to beat Hungary, and 3 changes were made by Moreira. The game was refereed by Englishman Arthur Ellis, who I can assure you would never have refereed a match so violent in his life. After their battering of West Germany, Hungary were without Puskás, but that didn't slow the mighty Magyars down, who ended the first half 2-1 up thanks to goals from Hidegkuti and Košice. Hungary were then awarded a penalty in the second half for a handball by Pinheiro, which angered Brazilian officials and journalists who ran onto the pitch. It was this penalty decision that seemingly started the non-footballing chaos as the game began to get more and more cynical. Indio of Brazil took out Hidegkuti and Cibor off the ball, and after Julinho made it through too with a phenomenal goal, Josef Bosic and Nilton Santos were sent off for fighting. Umberto Tozzi then hit Hungary with a strike of his own. No, he didn't score, he kicked Gula Laurent and got himself sent off. With 2 minutes left on the clock, Košice scored Hungary's 4th in what ended up being a 4-2 triumph, in a game that saw 42 fouls and 3 players sent off. Nevertheless, although the game had finished, the fighting had not. Linesman Bill Ling reported that Mourinho struck a Hungarian as they were walking off. The Brazilians also stormed into the Hungarian dressing room where Puskás allegedly hit Pinheiro with a bottle, and Hungarian coach Sebes was also hit in the scuffle, requiring 4 stitches. Referee Arthur Ellis commented, "I thought it was going to be the greatest game I ever saw, but it turned out to be a disgrace." In response to the violence, Sebes banned Hungary's upcoming tours of Brazil, and FIFA, well, despite being pressured into taking action, did precisely nothing. Also, do you remember Mario Viana, the referee from the Switzerland-Italy game? Yeah, he accused referee Ellis of being a communist agent. When the semi-finals approached kickoff on the 30th of June, one question was asked by the English press. Were we going to see another Battle of Bern situation between Hungary and Uruguay? The likely answer was no, as security was heightened to guard the dressing rooms, and the referee for the game was Welshman Merv Griffiths, who is seen as the world's strictest referee. Anyway, all this talk of potential hostility between the two nations was taken away from the fact that this game had the potential to be incredible. This was the game most people had predicted to be the final, the world champions versus the world champions-elect, and I tell you what, it didn't disappoint. Both teams were forced into changes. Still without Puskás, Hungary made 2 changes as both Michal and Josef Tut were dropped for Laszlo Budaj and Peter Palotas. For Uruguay, an injured Julio Abadi was replaced by Rafael Souto, and to the outrage of many, Oscar Miguez was dropped for Juan Højbjerg in attack. The day before the game, Miguez was in Lopez's starting 11. However, a vote including Uruguayan delegates to drop Miguez had taken place. The reason for this vote was down to Miguez's ego and unnecessary showboating in games, which resulted in a spat between Miguez and Luis Troccoli, one of the delegates. But their biggest issue would come in midfield, as inspirational captain Varela would miss out due to the injury picked up against England. His replacement, Nestor Carballo, was a player out of the Varela mould according to the Uruguayans. In the pouring rain, the game kicked off in Lausanne, and Uruguay managed to keep Hungary at bay for an entire 13 minutes, which was honestly quite impressive, before Cibor scored his 3rd of the tournament. Yet, unlike other games, Hungary didn't run away with it, as the world champions stifled many Hungarian attacks, and as the half-time whistle blew, the score was only 1-0. Nevertheless, all of Uruguay's hard work would quickly be undone when they lost the ball from kickoff and on the counter conceded to a Hidegkuti header. The game really should have been over, But Uruguay had other ideas, who produced an insane final 15 minutes. Hungary allowed some pressure from Uruguay, which was to be their downfall, and in the space of 11 minutes, 2 Jan Højbjerg goals brought the game level. However, amidst all the excitement, during the celebrations for his second goal, Højbjerg fainted and required instant medical attention, as it turns out he had suffered a cardiac arrest and had died for 15 seconds, only being saved by team doctor Carlos Abate, who gave him chest massages and a shot of Coramine, a drug which increases your breathing rate. Højbjerg then came back onto the pitch and hit the post from outside of the box. I'm not joking when I say that, and the game went into extra time. Really, not much in terms of goalmouth action happened in the first half of extra time, but Uruguay's right half Victor Andrade had to go off with a leg injury. Andrade had been La Celeste's best defender, and with Uruguay now down to 10 men, with one of them recently coming back to life, Hungary pounced, as 2 headers from Goldenhead Sandor Kocsis handed Uruguay their first ever loss at a World Cup, and Hungary a second World Cup final. What the fans in Lausanne had just witnessed would be dubbed the game of the century for many years to come. Legendary journalist Gianni Brera of La Gazzetta dello Sport put it perfectly. The most beautiful game I've ever seen played. I learned more in those 2 hours than in 20 years of playing and being a football critic. It was a drama full of competitiveness, full of epic moments in every nook and cranny. It wasn't a football game, it was a planetary event, 2 empires clashing. In my eyes, the top technical and competitive game, the most beautiful in the world. It was a compendium of football played until then and thereafter. Now, the same time this all-time classic was being played, 135 kilometers away in Basel, an absolute demolition was taking place. Even in front of an estimated 40,000 West German fans, Austria were big favourites going into the game. But the West Germans played Austria at arguably the worst time possible. Remember, only 4 days prior, Austria had been involved in one of the most intense matches in the history of the game against Switzerland, and one of the casualties of it was their goalkeeper Kurt Schmid, who was replaced by Walter Zeeman. Seeing that Austria were capable of conceding a bucket load of goals, Højbjerg was confident that his German side, who had surprisingly overcome Yugoslavia quite comfortably, could get one over on Austria. West Germany themselves made one change, as Josef Posipal came in for Fritz Laband. The Germans played absolutely out of their skin during this game, yet one man stole the headlines, their captain, Fritz Walter. Much like the Yugoslavia game, Walter did an unbelievable job in marking Austria's best player Ernst Ockwerk out of the game. His marking and pressing wasn't everything he brought to this game, however. In a 6-1 thrashing of the Austrians, Walter scored 2 and assisted 3, and his performance was forever written into World Cup and German legend. One journalist in a German newspaper wrote, "Technician, director, striker, corner kick artist, free kick specialist and fighter." Ockwerk had probably never imagined that the offensive Fritz would leave him empty-handed so often, and that the defensive Fritz would so often prevent him from making his famous passes. West Germany were shockingly in the World Cup final, whereas Austria went into the 3rd place playoff where they beat Uruguay 3-1. This confirmed Austria's greatest World Cup finish ever. So we now return to the beginning of the video. It was time for the final. The amateur side that had overcome the odds and nobody expected to win, West Germany, against the overwhelming favourites, the near-robotic, tactically proficient, unbeaten in a record 31 games, Hungary. Hungary naturally came in as favourites. The team decided against training on the Thursday and Friday before completing a minor session the day before the final. Sebes made 2 changes from the semi-final against Uruguay. Laszlo Budaj was replaced by Michal Todt, who then switched wings with Sibor, as Sibor could attack the slower Werner Kohlmeier, and Todt could help Lantos double up on Helmut Rahn. The other change, Peter Palotas out, Ferenc Puskás in. By reaching the final, Højbjerg's gamble of playing a weakened side against Hungary in the group stage had paid off. Because the West German defence had tightened immeasurably and confidence was at an all-time high, no changes were made from their semi-final win. Højbjerg wanted it to play out similar to the Yugoslavia and Austria games, sit back and hit on the counter. One of his tactical plans was for Horst Eckel to mark Hidegkuti, preventing the Hungarian from pulling Werner Liebrich out of defence. Also, Højbjerg instructed Hans Schäfer to join Fritz Walter in covering Boschik. The day started off without a cloud in the sky. However, as the game edged ever closer, Fritz Walter Weather was looking like a real possibility, and by kickoff, it was hammering it down. It was known as Fritz Walter Wetter because Walter, who had suffered from malaria, preferred the wet conditions to the hot, humid climates, and it's in these grim conditions where Walter often produced his greatest performances. The torrential rain didn't just benefit Walter, it benefited the entire team, as on their bench was Adi Dassler, founder of Adidas. Not only were his boots incredibly light, he had invented longer screw-in studs, which would prove vital as those longer German studs gave them added grip on the muddy bog that was the football pitch. As the rain continued to pour, Dassler advised that the longer studs be used. Screw them in, demanded Herberger. The game kicked off, and Hungary flew into a 2-goal lead thanks to Puskás and Cibor, the second coming after a comedic error between Kohlmeier and Turek. This was looking like it would be business as usual for the mighty Magyars until just 2 minutes after Cibor made it 2-0, when Max Morlock pulled one back. 8 minutes later, Rot-Weiss Essen's Helmut Rahn made it 2-2. The first half remained chaotic, but no goals were scored. At half-time, Sebes put Cibor back into his more natural outside left position, and the chances wouldn't stop. By the 54th minute, Hungary had created a multitude of chances, only to be denied by the Bar, Werner Kohlmeier and Tony Turek in goal. Then it happened. With just 6 minutes remaining, Helmut Rahn won the second ball, dribbled with it, and with the iconic commentary of Herbert Zimmermann in the background, slammed the ball into the bottom corner. Hungary had barely any time left to level the game, and despite a dubious offside call on Puskás and a gilt-edged chance for Cibor, Hungary couldn't find an equaliser. Similar to Uruguay 4 years prior, the amateurs West Germany had shocked everybody by winning the World Cup against what was considered to be a much stronger opponent. Overwhelmed with emotions, Herberger said, "We are too upset by our joy at the moment to be able to fully grasp the fact that we are the world champions." Jules Rimet presented the trophy to Fritz Walter, who would also receive a sporting handshake from Puskás. Rimet exclaimed during the presentation, "You have won this well. Guard the trophy carefully for the spiritual value it represents." So, how did each nation take this result? Well, the Hungarian public and high-ranking officials were off to say the least. Demonstrations broke out in the streets of Budapest aimed at both the team and the regime. In fact, Hungary's goalkeeper Grosics believed that the defeat planted the seeds of the Hungarian Revolution 2 years later, which essentially killed Hungary as a footballing powerhouse. Speaking of Grosics, as a man whose political opinion was known to be anti-communist, and the fact goalkeepers genuinely take a lot of the blame, he was hit hard by the regime. Arriving back into Hungary, he was arrested, interrogated, and was told he was under suspicion for espionage. Again. If found guilty, the death penalty was very much on the cards. Fortunately, he was never charged, but he was taken away weekly by the authorities for interrogation. West Germany, on the other hand, took the result a little better. Surprisingly. This win was a huge turning point for the country after what had happened during the Second World War. It was a country in need of something to unite the people and make them proud of their country, and this certainly did that. German author Joachim Fest said it best. It was a kind of liberation for the Germans from all the things that weighed down upon them after the Second World War. July 4th, 1954 is in certain aspects the founding day of the German Republic. Horst Eckel, who had marked Hidegkuti out of the game, also said, "All over the world, we were not recognised politically, economically, and athletically. After this victory, we were suddenly someone again. We had played a little part in helping to rebuild West Germany. It made us proud that we had been able to do our bit." So for the first time ever, West Germany were world champions. But was it fair? Soon after, rumours came about that the West Germans had taken performing-enhancing drugs. Members of the team fell ill with jaundice, and 8 years after the final, squad member Richard Herman died of long-term liver problems, likely caused by potential drugs. Puskás, who originally congratulated West Germany on the win, quickly changed his tune after spotting their players vomiting in the dressing room, and he accused them of doping. In response, the DFB actually banned any of its clubs from playing against a team involving Puskás. The Magyar, in fact, had to apologise for his comments in order for Real Madrid's 1960 European Cup final against Eintracht Frankfurt to go ahead, a game which he scored 4 goals in. Years later, an 800-page report by Berlin's Humboldt University found the West Germans were given a drug called Pervitin, an amphetamine produced by Nazis to make soldiers fight longer and harder. So, with the 1954 World Cup in the history books, let's take a look at some facts and figures. Toni Turek became the oldest winner of the World Cup, and Fritz and Ottmar Walter became the first brothers to win the World Cup. The 1954 World Cup saw 0 sides remain undefeated, the only time this has ever happened. Hungary's 27 goals in this World Cup beat Brazil's record of 22 in 1950, and it's still a record to this very day. If you count the playoff game against Turkey, West Germany would be second with 25 goals. Sandor Kocsis finished as the top scorer with 11 goals, becoming the first player to hit double figures in the competition's history. There were 140 goals in 26 games, an average of 5.38, another record. Finally, with an average of 29,562, over 768,000 fans attended what, in my opinion, is the greatest World Cup of all time.